The last days of forgotten lands, a tale of lost civilizations. The sky burned red as the sea raged, swallowing entire cities in a single breath. Across the world, in lands now lost to time, civilizations stood on the precipice of destruction, their kings and sages watching helplessly as the wrath of the heavens descended upon them. Far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the great empire of Atlantis, a beacon of power, knowledge, and wealth, stood at the height of its dominion. Its mighty navy ruled the sea, its golden temples gleamed under the sun, and its people, descendants of gods and men, held the secrets of an advanced world. But as their pride swelled, so did their hunger for conquest. Their armies stretched their hands across the Mediterranean, threatening the free cities of the world. The gods, enraged at their arrogance, sent their judgment. Timaeus 25 says, in a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, never to be seen again. The waters surged, and Atlantis, with all its splendor, crumbled into the abyss, its once proud towers lost beneath the waves. But it was not the only kingdom to fall. Across the world, in the golden lands of Dvārakā, the city of the god King Krishna, music and festivity filled the air as the people reveled in their prosperity. Towers of ivory and gold rose above the sacred waters, and the streets were lined with gemstones that reflected the brilliance of the celestial realms. Yet the moment of reckoning was near. A prophecy had foretold the city's doom, whispering of a time when Krishna would leave the mortal world, and with him the blessing that held Dvārakā above the waters. That day had come. As Krishna's soul departed to the heavens, the sea roared and the city trembled. The ocean rose and swallowed the beautiful city, leaving behind only the whisper of waves over the ruins. The people ran, screaming for mercy, but the ocean showed none. Dvārakā, once the jewel of India, disappeared beneath the waves, its temples, now the dwelling of sea creatures. Far to the north, beyond the icy winds, Hyperborea and Thule, lands of eternal light, where the sun never set, stood untouched by war, famine, and decay. Here, men lived in harmony, their wisdom surpassing that of any who walked the earth. Yet even these sacred lands were not beyond the grasp of fate. The glaciers crept forward, the seas rose, and the land itself trembled. In the dark hours, the people of Hyperborea watched as their once endless daylight faded, the sun setting for the first time in an age. The land, swallowed by the cold, was lost, its people scattered to the corners of the world, bearing the last remnants of an ancient knowledge now forgotten. From Pindar Odes we see, beyond the north winds lies the land of Hyperborea, where the sun never sets, but in the time of the great flood, it was said that much of their land was lost to the sea. In the west, across the great ocean, Toulon, the city of the Toltecs, stood in glory, watched over by the plumed serpent god, Quetzalcoatl. Here, men lived by their wisdom of the gods, their temple stretching toward the heavens. Their knowledge rivaling that of the ancients. Yet the winds carried omens of doom. Betrayed by his own people, Quetzalcoatl was cast out, and with him the blessing of the gods was withdrawn. The once thriving city fell into chaos, its people consumed by war, famine, and pestilence. The Lord departed, sailing eastward on a craft of serpents, vowing to return when the time of men was restored. As Quetzalcoatl vanished beyond the horizon, the city crumbled, its towers reduced to ruins, its people scattered like leaves in the wind. The echoes of its greatness faded into legend. And in the emerald lands of the far west, Fomorians, a race of one-eyed giants, watched from their most covered island as their world collapsed. The sea, once their ally, turned against them. A storm unlike any before swept across the land, and the waves rose higher than mountains, consuming the dark towers of their king, Balor of the Evil Eye. The Fomorian kingdom, feared by all, was lost beneath their waves, their survivors arriving as exiles upon the shores of Ireland. From the West Sea came the Fomorians, their homeland swallowed by the ocean, their power broken, seeking dominion over the last lands of men. Across the world, the great civilizations fell, their splendor lost, their names whispered in myth and memory. Some survivors wandered to new lands, bringing with them the fragments of a shattered past, weaving the tales of lost empires into the histories of the future. Others disappeared entirely, leaving behind only ruins and riddles beneath the waves. The sea had claimed them all, and yet the world remembered. Welcome to Legendary Oracles. Hello, I am Dr. David Santos, and in this video we're going to be continuing our study in ancient pagan myths and religions. And we get one of the most famous and most interesting of all the legends and myths looking back through history, and that is the story of Atlantis. This is a story that's captured so many people's minds and imaginations as they've considered what Atlantis was. They've looked at the mythology, they've looked at all the stories, and for many of us, thinking about, was this a legendized, mythologized version of the antediluvian pre-flood world? Is it something other than that? I mean, we did see kingdoms disappearing after the flood as well. But whatever it may be, Atlantis is described in near miraculous ways, of having technology and having so many things that we would not normally attribute to the ancient world. They had technology, at least within the stories. They had all kinds of stuff. And it just disappeared. So when we look at the legend of Atlantis, we need to understand it was introduced by Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. This thing's captivated scholars and enthusiasts for centuries. And Plato describes Atlantis as a powerful and technologically advanced civilization, and it ultimately succumbed to moral decay. And that's where people want to turn this into more myth than actual historical account. And maybe they're right, and maybe they're not. We'll look at some stuff on that. But they see it as this tale of warning and a tale to understand what virtues are versus what it is to not be virtuous and the consequences of that. So the tale of Atlantis is not an isolated account, though. So if they're only looking at this as an allegory on perils of hubris and the consequences of societal corruption, we have to apply that broadly against a whole bunch of other accounts like this. And maybe it is. Maybe this is just an account that is mythologized from the pre-flood world, then the flood, then the Tower of Babel, and then nations scatter around. And as they scatter around, what happens is they take their own version someplace and they have this cultural memory of the pre-flood world. Or it's something more recent than that. So either way, the tale of Atlantis is not an isolated account. Numerous cultures have myths of advanced civilizations that face destruction due to their pride and moral failings, just like almost, if not every civilization, has some sort of flood mythology. So these stories often convey themes of divine judgment and moral failings. These stories often convey themes of catastrophic downfall of once great civilizations. So in this lecture, we're going to explore the myth of Atlantis and its connections to other submerged civilizations across global traditions. We will examine how themes of pride and destruction and divine judgment are prevalent in these narratives. These reflect universal concerns about ethical and moral conduct of societies. Certainly, at least something we should be talking about, even if we're not concerned about destruction of our society through a flood. But we should be concerned about how are we called to live. And the ancient people are concerned about those things as well. And that's part of the reason these things get stuck in the cultural consciousness and passed on. By analyzing these myths, we aim to understand the cultural significance of such stories and the lessons they impart about human behavior, societal values, and the consequences of moral decay. This exploration will provide insight into how ancient civilizations perceive a relationship between human action and divine will. So as we're thinking about ancient religions, we need to understand what did they think about the gods and what did the gods expect from people. And that's one of the things we get an opportunity to look at here. Through this examination, we'll gain a deeper appreciation for the enduring power of these myths and their relevance to contemporary discussions about ethics, governance, and certainly the human condition, something we should all be thinking about. So as we start to look at Atlantis, where we have to start is the Greek tradition and start by looking at Plato's Atlantis. The myth of Atlantis, as described by Plato, is one of the most famous and enduring legends in Western civilization. Whether taken as an allegory, a moral lesson, or a distorted memory of real civilization, it has continued to captivate scholars for centuries. Plato presents the tale of Atlantis as a historical account, which was passed down from Egyptian priests to the Athenian statesman Solon. And Solon's a guy we know about. Solon. We know who he is. We know that he was actually a person. And it's interesting because as this story is passed along, the Egyptians claim to have a much longer antiquity than any of the Greeks. The Greeks don't remember this, but the Egyptians, they do have a longer cultural memory. So this Egyptian priest passes this stuff along to Solon, and then it's later recorded in Plato's dialogue, Timaeus and Critias, in about the 4th century BC. These dialogues describe Atlantis as a once powerful and advanced civilization, but one that ultimately succumbed to moral decay. We see divine punishment. We see total destruction. The story has been widely debated by some scholars, interpreting as a political commentary on imperial Athens. Others argue that it has a actual historical origin, linking it to real ancient civilizations, kind of like the Minoan Crete, and maybe even identifying Minoan Crete as Atlantis. That's probably not actually tenable, but some people have done that. If nothing else, looking at the Minoan civilization as a similar event where a civilization was there. We can find the ruins there. We can find archaeological evidence. There's this great civilization, and then they're just gone. They disappeared. But that's a story for another day. Just to show you that these things do happen. Now, when we look at the primary source, Plato's Timaeus and Critias, the earliest and most detailed accounts of Atlantis appear in this work. In these dialogues, Atlantis is described as this vast island. It's an empire that is beyond the Pillars of Hercules, modern-day Straits of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, with an impressive maritime force, a highly organized government, and technological advancements beyond those of contemporary civilizations. So this quote is from Timaeus 24 and 25, kind of the end of 24. And it says, "For it is related to our records, how once upon a time your state stayed the course of a mighty host, which, starting from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean, was insolently advancing to attack the whole of Europe and Asia to boot. For the ocean there was at that time navigable, for in front of the mouth, which you Greeks call, as you say, the Pillars of Hercules, there lay an island, which was larger than Libya and Asia together." Again, from Timaeus 24 and 25. According to Plato, Atlantis was an imperialist power. It was seeking to conquer large parts of the known world. However, it was ultimately defeated by Athens. It's very Greek of them, which Plato represents as the virtuous counterforce to the Atlantean Empire. This framing of Athens as a morally superior civilization, it certainly has the flavor of suggesting that the story serves as a moral lesson rather than purely historical account. So in Critias, Plato expands on the structure and government of Atlantis, stating that it was originally ruled by 10 kings. These are descendants of the gods, of the god Poseidon. The kings divided the land amongst themselves, governing their portions in harmony and justice. Of course it did. In Critias 1:13, it says, "They divided the island of Atlantis into 10 portions and gave to the firstborn of the eldest of their descendants the supreme power over the rest. Each of the others had rule over many men and great tracts of the country." So just to continue to try to give you a flavor what the primary sources original documents where we get this, how they describe Atlantis. So initially, in Atlantis, the people there lived virtuously, maintaining divine favor and justice. However, over time, they become greedy, materialistic, and corrupt. And when they do so, they forsake their original virtues. And this moral decline is described in Critias 121, where it says, "But when the divine portions begin to fade away and become diluted too often and too much with the moral admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, they then, unable to bear their fortune, behaved unseemingly, and to him who had an eye to see, they began to appear base and lost the fairness of their precious gifts. But to those who had no eye to see the true happiness, they still seemed glorious and blessed at the very time when they were filled with unrighteous, adverse, and power." So you can see the direction that these accounts are going. Adding to that, the Atlanteans' descent into corruption and arrogance prompted the gods to punish them with total destruction. According to Timaeus, a massive cataclysm, earthquakes, and floods caused Atlantis to sink into the ocean in a single day and night. Again, from Timaeus, it says, "But afterward, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods. In a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, was swallowed up by the sea and vanished, whence also the ocean at that spot has now become impassable and unsearchable, being blocked up by the shoal mud which the island created as it settled down." So, okay, this thing sinks and is covered up by all this mud, unsearchable, can't be found. And the sudden cataclysm swallowing Atlantis beneath the waves functioned as a cautionary tale of this divine retribution against these hubris and moral corruption. So let's look at historical and philosophical interpretations for a minute. Plato's account of Atlantis has been the subject of various interpretations, with scholars debating whether it was intended as a literal historical account, a political allegory, or a philosophical lesson. So as these scholars argue, this one, Catherine Morgan in 1998 argues that Atlantis is not meant to be taken in a literal history, but as a critique of imperial Athens. She highlights how Plato contrasts the corruption of Atlantis with the idealized democracy of Athens. And that's something we already mentioned. It has the feel to some degree of simply being a mythology with the intention of making Athens maybe look better than it actually was, but putting it in light of being the superior civilization. Of course, when we look at those things, the story serves as a warning in that view. Serves as a warning against the moral decay of contemporary Athens, particularly in light of the Peloponnesian War and eventual fall of the Athenian Empire. Casey Stegman, 2017, supports this interpretation and viewing Atlantis as a metaphor for the fragility of democracy. He suggests that Plato may have drawn from historical events such as Athens' failed Sicilian expedition, 415, 413 BC, where imperial overreach led to disaster. So according to this reading, Atlantis symbolizes the dangers of a once powerful state losing its moral compass, such as Athens struggled with. Samuel Flores, 2018, examines the role of Critias, the narrator of the Atlantis story, and he argued that his personal history influences the dialogue. Critias was a real historical figure who participated in the oligarchic group of roughly 400 BC, which temporarily overthrew Athenian democracy by making Critias the storyteller of Athens and its downfall. Plato may be subtly critiquing the dangers of tyranny. And along with that, imperial ambition. So despite its philosophical significance, many scholars and archaeologists have searched for real-world inspiration for Athens or Atlantis, proposing that Plato's story may be a memory of actual historical events. Two leading theories suggest connections to Minoan Crete and the Santorini or Thera volcanic eruption. One of the strongest theories links Atlantis to the Minoan civilization, which thrived about 2700 to 1100 BC and was one of the most advanced cultures of the ancient world. No matter how much we dig into this, they weren't advanced as the stories say Atlantis was, but that's a different story for now. We'll hang on to that thought. The Minoans developed a vast maritime empire. They elaborate on all the things that they had, including the architecture and advanced engineering. However, the civilization declined rapidly, possibly due to this eruption around 1600 BC. The Thera eruption hypothesis suggests that the violent volcanic eruption devastated Minoan Crete, causing a tsunami and economic decline. This is all probably true. Problem is that Atlantis, or is this a completely separate event? But before I get ahead of myself, 2002, Katrina Stankowski reviewed these geological evidence linking the Thera eruption to the destruction of an advanced civilization. This eruption produced massive ash clouds, tsunamis, earthquakes, and that could certainly explain what happened there in Crete. And it could possibly be the origin of Plato's description of Atlantis sinking due to earthquakes and floods. Maybe. If we go back, Philip Combs Knapp, 1919, proposed, 1919, this is an old article. He proposed that the Minoans inspired the Atlantis myth. He noted similarities between Plato's account of Atlantis and Minoan Crete. Both had maritime powers, both had advanced architecture and engineering, both suffered sudden collapse. So Plato's Atlantis remains one of the most debated myths in history, while serves as political and philosophical allegory, and may also preserve echoes of real civilization. And what we're talking about in the literature, in academia, because that's part of what we need to do here. Whether entirely fictional or based on historical events, the story of Atlantis continues to captivate scholars, historians, and archaeologists. And the myths, themes of hubris, moral decay, divine punishment, etc., it does serve as this timeless warning of unchecked power and corruption. So we can definitely take it and find it useful in that fashion. All right, so let's have a little bit of fun with this, and let's talk about views on Atlantis as a real place. And as I've demonstrated to you, most of the scholars regard Atlantis as a philosophical allegory. Others argue that Plato's account contains historical truths that are distorted over time. So the search for Atlantis has led to these numerous hypotheses, and they range from connections with known ancient civilizations to more speculative locations deep underwater or even beneath ice. Some researchers believe that Atlantis may have been a pre-Ice Age civilization lost to cataclysm, while others suggest it was an early advanced culture predating recorded history. So just for the record, today, now my view on this could change. It's not a salvific issue. It's complicated. I think right now I would be inclined to lean towards looking at Atlantis as a memory of the pre-flood civilization. And I think that's probably where I'd land right now. But let's look at a few other things. The Plato's detailed account in Timaeus and Critias. Plato's description of Atlantis is very detailed. It specifies the geography, what the society was like, government, and downfall. Unlike purely mythical stories, he places Atlantis within a historical framework, and he links it to real ancient events, and he emphasizes that it was recorded by Egyptian priests who relayed that to Solon. He states, in the first place, we must remember that in all 9,000 years have elapsed since the war, which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside of the Pillars of Hercules and all who dwelt within them. So it's Timaeus 24. And so he's putting it within a historical framework, which is important. Ancient writings almost, if not always, use geography that they know and understand. They don't make up locations. They don't write about. I don't think someone's not going to get me. They don't write about Narnia. It's outside of space and time. They write about even the things that are in heaven. It's the arc of the sun going over the lands that we know. It's within the framework. Underworld, it's still within the, there's a place that they're going from here to there. When they're writing about geography, they use the geography that they know. So that's just how these ancient writings work. So if they're using geography that makes sense, it actually lends towards it having something within reality, or at least they thought so. Put it that way. They're not trying to intentionally write an allegorical story with this specific discussion of virtue and a warning of going away from their virtues. It doesn't seem like that's really what it's meant to do. It seems more like it's trying to tell a story from ancient past within the framework of how they could understand it. So there's this precision in Plato's narrative that includes these engineering details, concentric rings of land and water, has led some scholars to believe it was not purely an invention, but based on an older tradition. The Santorini eruption, or Thera eruption, and the Minoans is one of the more common views. The devastated Minoan civilization on Crete. It included the surrounding Aegean islands, and it causes massive tsunamis, and like we talked about, And here's just the sudden collapse that took place. Well, that it is something that took place, and those are the sea people. We know who they are and when this took place, and kind of where they went in some cases as well. So the Minoans had paved roads, multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, and advanced artistry. To some degree, it resembles Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. Some archaeologists link the destruction of Thera to Atlantis, and this started about the 20th century. Some researchers believe that the Minoan trade network stretching across the Mediterranean may have influenced the legend of a great lost civilization. A location that's often discussed is the Rakat structure. It's Eye of the Sahara. And this is fairly recent. Theory suggests that Atlantis may have been located in Africa at the Rakat structure. And it's this massive geological formation in the Sahara Desert that strongly resembles Plato's description of Atlantis and these concentric rings. And it's got this big diameter, about 25 miles, closely matches Plato's measurements of Atlantis' central city. The area is once lush and had rivers and water sources, along with the Great Plain as described in Critias. There's ancient artifacts such as prehistoric pottery and stone ruins that indicate that an advanced settlement once existed in this region before its desertification. And that's all fine. This theory suggests that an ancient civilization in the Sahara was wiped out by floods or climate change, leaving only geological traces behind. So, sunken structures and underwater discoveries. Several submerged ruins worldwide have been proposed as remnants of lost pre-Ice Age civilization, possibly linked to Atlantis. And this is the Bimini Road in the Bahamas. It's a formation discovered in 1968, resembling an ancient road or harbor structure. Some believe it's evidence of an advanced maritime capability. Cuba's underwater ruins in 2001, sonar scans revealed possible megalithic structures deep off the Cuban coast. This led to speculation pertaining to lost civilizations. And Dvārakā, this is ancient sunken ruins off the coast of off India. It matches descriptions in Hindu text paralleling the ideas of Atlantis as a highly advanced coastal civilization lost to the sea. So let's have some fun here and think about some of the stuff that appears in the legends of Atlantis. And it's one of the most intriguing aspects of the Atlantis legend is the claim that it was possibly highly advanced, had incredible technology, and while mainstream scholars view this as myth, of course, some alternative researchers argue that descriptions of Atlantean society suggest lost knowledge of energy, aviation, and engineering. First is the firestone or energy crystals and wireless power. This one gets a lot of play in certain kinds of circles, but when this is mentioned, these kinds of things show up in other civilizations as far as their thoughts about the ancient worlds. And when we consider what the pre-flood world was like, we shouldn't be applying these ideas of what our ancient world was like just because it was before that. We don't know what they had or what their capabilities were in the pre-flood world. So Edgar Cayce, he's an interesting figure if you've ever looked into him. He's called the Sleeping Prophet. And he described Atlantis as having a power system based on energy crystals called the Firestone that transmitted wireless electricity similar to Nikola Tesla's view of how power ought to work. It's the Wardenclyffe Tower. Some theorists speculate that Atlantis may have used geothermal, solar, or electromagnetic energy to power buildings, ships, and advanced technology. Plato described vast metal structures that covered in it's or calcium, something like that, and it's a mysterious golden red alloy that may have had electrical properties. They have stories of flying machines, anti-gravity technology, and some of the more esoteric sources suggest that Atlantis had aircraft or even anti-gravity flying machines similar to some of the technology found in Hindu texts. Ancient petroglyphs in Egypt and the Americas depict human figures operating what appear to be flying vehicles. But we're not making an episode of Ancient Aliens. I'm just telling you some of the more interesting things that appear out there. Plato states that Atlantis had vast trade networks and rapid transport systems, and it suggests advanced seafaring or even aerial transport. Luxuries and comforts. Plato describes a civilization with hot and cold running water, advanced city planning, massive public structures, far ahead of contemporary society. Critias describes plazas, temples, elaborate road systems, suggesting high-level engineering, and the infrastructure featuring bridges, canals, harbors indicates a highly organized urban society similar to the Minoans or Romans, but at an age even earlier. So that many of these things at the end there, they're already aware of within Greco-Roman culture. So it makes sense for them to picture some of this that way. Other aspects of this absolutely makes no sense for them to try to insert they can fly. That's crazy. Or they had wireless energy. These things make no sense unless they're stories coming from somewhere. Theories of cataclysm and destruction. Plato attributes Atlantis' fall to divine punishment. The naturalistic versions are volcanic eruption, Santorini, this asteroid impact, tsunami or flooding. Coastal cities were lost beneath rising seas. We've seen that. Some theories go as far as magnetic pole shifts, extreme climate changes in the Rakat structure, where once thriving region turned into desert, and Plato describes Atlantis' downfall as, from Timaeus 25, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and a night of misfortune, the entire city disappeared into the depths of the sea. So if Atlantis was real, then its fate could parallel other sudden collapses in history, like the Minoans and others that we're going to mention some more as we go here, or even the collapse of Rome, although that's remembered and we know how it happened, but on a more catastrophic scale. So the search for Atlantis remains one of history's great mysteries. While mainstream scholars dismiss it as a myth, the best evidence supporting its reality include Plato's detailed descriptions of the technology, their advancements, far beyond more normal mythology. This connection between the Minoan culture and some sort of destruction, probably volcanic, is a good connection. Things like the Dvārakā structure, whose geography closely matched Plato's concentric ring design. There's others as well. We see underwater ruins worldwide, suggesting that something took place and that this sort of thing is possible. Speculation on advanced energy, flight, and metallurgy, hinting at forgotten ancient knowledge. It's kind of like when you read some books like say First Enoch. You read the book of Enoch, and you see that they're talking about ancient technologies. They're talking about technology that shouldn't exist in the world that we are describing, and yet they do. They're talking about strange things that they should have absolutely no understanding of or interest in, and yet they do. So, though no definitive proof exists, ongoing discoveries in archaeology, geology, and history may one day reveal whether Atlantis was merely a cautionary tale about human, I'll just call it human sin, or forgotten civilization waiting to be rediscovered. There are other civilizations out there and other traditions that we want to at least mention. The myth of Atlantis is not completely unique in global traditions. There's numerous ancient cultures that recount stories of powerful cities or civilizations that were lost to cataclysmic floods, whether it's through divine punishment or natural disasters. These myths serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, moral corruption, and the limits of human ambition. So in this section, we're going to explore two prominent examples, and that first one is the Dvārakā from the Indian tradition, and Eridu from the Mesopotamian myth. These submerged cities share many thematic elements with Atlantis, including divine involvement, extraordinary wealth and power, and ultimate destruction through water. And that point right there, the destruction through water, is one of the reasons that it makes me really want to think of these things in terms of a mythologized version of the actual flood event that took place, and then after the Tower of Babel, taking all these things out, and through time redesigning the actual story to meet the civilization and the culture that you have developed. So you go off into your own little world and you develop a new pantheon. You get rid of that one god, you add some gods in, and then pretty soon you redesign the flood with your stories built around it. So in this case, Dvārakā, meaning the gate city, is one of the 7 sacred cities of Hinduism and plays a vital role in Krishna's life as recounted in their holy books. I'm not even going to try those. And according to Hindu tradition, Dvārakā was built by Krishna, who established it as a magnificent and fortified city along the western coast of India. It's described as a place of remarkable opulence, technological advancement, and divine blessing. And to quote from, it's the Bhagav. Well, I'll try to get it out for you guys. I can hear it perfectly. I can't always say it. It's the Bhagavata Purana. Hopefully I didn't mess it. I'm sure I messed it up. But it's from Canto 11. And it describes the city's destruction. In a quote, on the very same day that Krishna departed for his abode, the powerful dark-bodied Kali, age descended on the world. The ocean rose and submerged the entire city of Dvārakā except for the residence of the Supreme Lord. So we see them quoted. Here's their city, complete destruction. The passage establishes the supernatural aspect of the city's submersion, and it frames it as part of a cosmic transition rather than just a natural disaster. Unlike Atlantis, which was destroyed due to moral failure, Dvārakā's disappearance is linked to Krishna's departure from the mortal world, signaling the end of... I'm going to try that one. Dvārapara Yuga and the beginning of the Kali Yuga. So it's like going from their golden age to now it's a time of moral decline. Golden age was there when Krishna was there. So archaeological evidence of a sunken city. The legend of Dvārakā has gained archaeological support through underwater excavation off the coast of India. 2001, a team led by the National Institute of Oceanography discovered submerged structures including stone walls, pillars, and artifacts dating back to 1500 BC or earlier. The layout of the ruins closely resembles the description of Dvārakā in Hindu texts. Marine archaeologists suggest that rising sea levels or seismic activity may have caused the city's gradual submersion. By the way, rising sea levels and global warming, climate change, whatever. If we talk about that, it's interesting. We can go back to say the first people coming here to America from Europe have monuments that indicate where the sea level was. And guess what? Hasn't changed at all. They're not underwater or they're not way up out of water. Now, other places like the Dead Sea, that's shrinking, but that's because less water is going in because it's being the inlet is having more and more water pulled out of it. So there's things like that. So definitely interested in being a good steward of our resources. Also not wanting to buy into the myth of Romans 1 worshiping the creation rather than the creator. Not wanting to fall into false errored science. Someone wants to talk about that in future. Be happy to do it. Connections to Atlantis, the Dvārakā Atlantis, share key structural and thematic similarities. Both cities were highly advanced and divinely favored, but ultimately lost beneath the sea. Atlantis is destroyed due to its moral decline and hubris, while Dvārakā's fate was preordained as part of this cosmic order. So the idea of a linear line going from point A to point B to point C. And in that case, they had to move on from the golden age into this age of decay. It's interesting because in our worldview, we do it the other way around. We're presently in the age of decay, in the age of sin, where the Noahic effect of sin has broken us, who we were meant to be. We're in our flesh. We have sin natures that incline us towards ungodliness, and yet we're anticipating the return of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who will then establish a kingdom in righteousness, and that part will be good, and then the age to come will be even better. The millennial kingdom basically being a kickoff event and dealing with the last remnants of sin. It's a dispensational world, guys. The different dispensations look a little bit differently. It's not multiple ways of salvation. It's one way of salvation. But but different means for testing is all that means. Okay. We'll see how that goes. These similarities suggest that the theme of submerged civilizations was a widespread cultural motif, possibly inspired by real geological events such as tsunami, rising sea levels, or ancient city collapses. In Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu and the Great Flood. Eridu, the first city. According to Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu was considered the earliest city of human civilization. It's established by the gods themselves. It appears in the Sumerian king list as the first city to receive divine kingship. And this quote from the Sumerian king list: when kingship came down from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, end quote. This suggests that Eridu was the prototype for later cities, much like Atlantis was depicted as an ideal civilization. So the cities dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who played a crucial role in maintaining order and civilization. Over time, however, Eridu declined and was later associated with the myth of the Great Flood, an event that mirrors the destruction of Atlantis by divine forces. And this is one of the reasons I tend to view this as pre-flood civilization, flood, and then destruction. The flood myth is a central theme in Mesopotamian mythology, recorded in texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atreus epic. The most well-known account appears in Gilgamesh, where the gods decide to wipe out humanity with a flood, similar to how Greek gods destroyed Atlantis. It says, where is this from? This is Epic of Gilgamesh, tablet 11. In those days, the world teemed, the people multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull. The great god Enlil heard the clamor and said to the gods in council, the uproar of mankind is intolerable, so let the flood be upon them. So from that point, this is a divine judgment done by water, resembling the Atlantis narrative and resembling the biblical narrative. The key difference, however, is that Atlantis is destroyed, whereas the Mesopotamian flood narrative involves a single survivor who preserves life and knowledge. Scholar from 1961, Eric Rayner, The Myth of the Seven Sages and Atlanteans. Eric Rayner, he examines the myth of the seven sages, the Apkallu, in Mesopotamian literature, suggesting a possible connection to the Atlantis story. The Apkallu, these are wise figures who brought divine knowledge to humanity, much like the Atlanteans who possessed advanced wisdom. Some traditions suggest that these sages returned to the divine realm after the flood, much like Atlantis sank into the ocean, taking its wisdom with it. This comparison suggests that the Atlantis myth may have been influenced by earlier Mesopotamian stories of lost wisdom and divine intervention. Quick comparative analysis. The shared theme of submerged civilizations across different cultures, with Atlantis or Dvārakā or Eridu, share some common elements. And they're all interested in divine punishment, moral decline. In one case, it's Krishna's departure and the ocean's rise, and this is part of the cosmic cycle and divine will. With Eridu, there's a great flood sent by the gods. Again, corruption, divine retribution. So all these reveal that human civilizations have long expressed fears about not being permanent. and the ideas of loss of power and the role of divine justice, whether these myths stem from the real geological disaster. We would describe that as the real biblical story, or they're more allegories. They're not. There's more to it than that. They reflect this universal concern, and mankind should have this fear of God's retribution because it is promised that it's ultimately coming. It's the day of the Lord, and we anticipate the day of the Lord. However, we also know that God knows how to preserve the righteous, and those that have righteousness are in Christ. So we don't have to fear those things. He knows how to preserve us. The story of Dvārakā and Eridu and Atlantis illustrate that the concept of lost civilization is deeply rooted in this cultural memory. And I think it's, like I've said, it's the cultural memory from the actual events. So there's this continuation and fascination by historians and archaeologists, theologians, as this connection between myth and reality. So in the next section, we're going to look at legends of supposed Atlantean descendants. And this is an important key to this as well. We see ancient Mesopotamians and from Sumer looking and going, these things after this flood came to us and brought us knowledge and wisdom and, I didn't use this word, but sciences, metallurgy and such. So important part for us to understand. Let's take a look. All right, so descendants of Atlantis in global mythology. This is an important part, like I said. The myth of Atlantis did not simply disappear with Plato's writings. Many cultures across the world preserve stories of great civilizations that are lost beneath the waves, whether exiled rulers and wandering survivors, refugees, who arrived from distant lands after their homelands were destroyed. These narratives often reflect Atlantis-like themes: cataclysms, destruction, divine punishment, remnants of lost wisdom, now potentially preserved in new lands. In this section, we're going to explore legends from Ireland, Mesoamerica, Norse, and Egyptian traditions that may preserve echoes of Atlantean diaspora, dispersion. So that may sound like an odd mix to you, and it is, but it just demonstrates how these myths, these stories, these memories get spread around the entire world. So beginning with the Irish mythology, the Fomorians are described as an ancient race that preyed upon and warred with the early Irish gods. The Tuatha De Danann, they are often depicted as monstrous seafaring invaders who arrived from a sunken land beyond the Western Sea. Their most infamous king, Balor, the Evilite. Let me pause for 1 second. I thought about holding on to this for later lectures when we get more into actual. We're starting with ancient, then we're going to classical, then we're going to look at after the classical section in the last third of our lecture series. But I wanted to build this in here to demonstrate that these very ancient stories continue to get passed down, and shows us that there's a line of continuation of these events and a continuation of the exact same theme all the way into this part of Ireland. So I just want to be able to see those connections and how prevalent these things are all around the world. So we see that they have this king, Balor the Evil Eye. He's one-eyed giant whose gaze could kill. We got a quote here from Cath Mage Turid. It's the Battle of Mog. There was a great chieftain among the Fomorians, Balor, and none could look upon his eye without perishing. When the great battle was fought, it was said that the land of the Fomorians had sunk beneath the waves, and they came to Ireland as exiles, seeking dominion over the island. So that's a 9th century Irish manuscript. The Fomorians arrived from a submerged homeland. It has this similarity to the Atlantean exile myth. Plato describes how Atlantis' survivors may have scattered to other lands after the island's destruction, and much of the Fomorians migrated to Ireland. Balor, the greatest leader, reflects the mythical and often destructive power attributed to lost civilizations of global myths. Some scholars have speculated that the Fomorians' sunken homeland could be a memory of prehistoric landmass now lost beneath the sea. They have some ideas about what that might be. But a submerged land bridge that once connected Britain and Ireland to mainland Europe. The connection between the Fomorians and the sea aligns with Atlantis, where the ocean both gave rise to and ultimately destroyed the civilization. Could the legend of Balor be a distorted memory of an ancient people displaced by rising sea levels? Probably not rising sea levels, but destructive events. Let's use something different. And it's something that sunk because of earthquakes or some sort of cataclysm, much like the supposed survivors of Atlantis. Whether or not Irish mythology preserves echoes of an Atlantean migration, the Fomorians fit the pattern of a powerful sea-based race from a lost homeland, seeking dominance in a new land. So let's move to the Mesopotamian tradition. Mesoamerican traditions, Quetzalcoatl, and the Toltecs. These are civilizers from across the ocean. So Mesoamerican myth frequently describes lost civilization and wandering civilizers who came from across the sea. The Toltecs and the god Quetzalcoatl are central figures in these traditions. Here's a quote from a 16th century Aztec manuscript. Our ancestors say that long ago, a great and wise lord named Quetzalcoatl ruled a shining city called Tolan, but he was betrayed and his people were cast into exile. Some say he went to the sea where he built a raft of serpents and departed, vowing to return. So, well, we almost had to talk about this when we were talking about serpents. This may appear later in the next lecture when we talk about dragons, fire-breathing serpents. So this narrative has these parallels to the Atlantis myth. Tolan, the legendary Toltec city, is described as a golden age civilization that fell due to corruption, war, and divine punishment. Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god, is often depicted as a white-robed bearded man who sailed eastward on a raft after a city's destruction, an image that closely resembles Greek and Egyptian myths of Atlantean survivors spreading knowledge. Some historians have speculated that the myth of Quetzalcoatl's return, which played a role in the Aztec response to the arrival of the Spanish echoes memories of a long-lost civilization across the Atlantic. The similarities between Quetzalcoatl and Atlantean legend suggest a common theme. That's what I've been trying to describe. There's this common theme. Mighty civilization lost to divine punishment, with its wisdom scattered among surviving peoples. Much of that, quote, wisdom lost as well. In Norse tradition, we have the Thule and Hyperborea, the sunken northern lands. The Norse and Greek traditions contain references Hyperborea and Thule, two lands often described as mystical, highly advanced civilization that vanished beneath the sea. There's a quote from Pindar Odes. It says, "Beyond the north wind lies the land of Hyperborea, where the sun never sets and the people live free of sickness and death. But in the time of the great flood, it was said that much of their land was lost to the sea." So again, linking it to a great flood. So I just see continues to bear out my thought of pre-flood civilization versus post-flood civilization. Similarly, Thule, which Roman sources describe as the northernmost land known to antiquity, sometimes said to have disappeared due to some sort of natural disaster or change or submersion. Some interpretations suggest that they may be distant memories of a real ancient civilization, now lost beneath the Arctic Sea or the North Sea. The mystical and utopian qualities resemble Plato's description of Atlantis before its fall. Norse myths sometimes describe a great flood or catastrophe that reshaped the world, much like the destruction of Atlantis. The idea of a vanished northern civilization swallowed by the sea or ice reflects similar fears found in Greek, Irish, and Mesoamerican traditions, suggesting that Atlantis narrative may have echoes in multiple global mythologies. J. Gwyn Griffin, 1985, Atlantis in Egypt, the priests as keepers of Atlantean memory. So in this work, Egyptian tradition may have preserved fragments of Atlantean knowledge as suggested by Gwyn Griffiths. Plato explicitly states that Egyptian priests were the ones who preserved the story of Atlantis, passing it to Solon. Egyptian records of pre-dynastic floods and lost lands may hint at the older cultural memory of Atlantis-like events. Some legends describe Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, as a survivor of a great flood who brought knowledge to Egypt. I think that one's especially interesting. This is a motif that closely resembles Atlantean survivors. Another work, Oliver R.H. Thomas, 2007, Hesiod, on the Western lands. It's a work. Describes Greek authors, Hesiod, and recording myths of distant Western lands beyond the Atlantic, which may hint at Atlantis-like stories in pre-Platonic Greece. That's pretty cool to know and important to understand. Hesiod's reference to the far west in Theogony suggests that the existence of mystical lands beyond the known world. Hellenicus is an early historian who mentioned seafarers reaching unknown western islands and perhaps influencing Plato's vision of Atlantis. These sources indicate that the concept of a powerful but doomed Western civilization was not exclusive to Plato, but may have had roots in earlier Greek thought. From Ireland to Mexico, from Greece to the Arctic, stories persist of civilizations lost to the sea, exiled rulers and wandering sages spreading forgotten knowledge. These myths suggest that Atlantis is part of the larger global tradition of submerged lands and exiled survivors. Reveal how different cultures preserve memories of great civilization and met their doom. Raise the possibility that ancient peoples witnessed a real geological event, and this later inspired myths of lost lands like Atlantis. So whether Atlantis is real or not, its theme of knowledge destruction and survival continues to resonate in myths worldwide, showing that humanity has long grappled with the mystery of lost civilizations and the fragility of human greatness. Okay, coming to a close, let's look at biblical insights, theological themes in Atlantis narrative. The Atlantis myth, with its theme of pride, corruption, judgment, loss of civilization, it really resonates with several biblical narratives. The Bible recounts similar stories in which human arrogance and moral failure lead to judgment, but it also offers hope through the promise of redemption and divine restoration. Judgment on human pride and corruption. Genesis 11. The Great Flood as a universal theme. Genesis 6 through 9. The hope of a restored civilization. Going all the way back. All the way forward. All the way forward up to the end of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22. This idea of a new Jerusalem. Redemption is the uniqueness that we have in Scripture. When we look at these events, we should remind ourselves that there was an event, the Tower of Babel, where the people were scattered because of their pride and arrogance and their desire to build this tower. We could get into that specifically of what they were trying to accomplish. But overall, in general, we could simply say they're not listening to what God has commanded. And Scripture says, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth, which is what they're supposed to do, by the way. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the children of man had built. But the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They have all one language. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. And so then this dispersion takes place. And they go out. As they go out, they take these memories with them. And as they, over time, they piece together what they remember. A great flood. We've looked at the great flood, but a judgment by water that it had to be done. Genesis 6, 5, 7, and 8. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of thoughts of the heart was only evil continuously. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And we're happy that he did, because that is how we got here. So all these things, these biblical accounts of ancient history can certainly be seen as the cultural memory being passed through generation after generation. And now here we are looking back at what took place, looking forward at what will take place. Revelation describes it, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and the sea was no more. So as we focused on this idea of the sea being used as an instrument of judgment over a people, there won't even be a sea. It won't be necessary, because sin and Satan and death will all have been dealt with. Look at this idea of death and think of 1 Corinthians 15 and go, death, where is your sting? I mean, it has no power anymore. It's been beaten on the cross by Christ, and we move into the age to come. And with that, we will conclude. I just will pray that your studies are going well, if you're enjoying the lectures, and if I can do anything for you, please let me know.